Hey everyone, and welcome to another deep dive. We get a lot of requests to really dig into specific topics, and well, today is one of those days. This one goes out to everyone who's ever felt that decision paralysis. That feeling where you're just overwhelmed with choices and you just don't know where to even
Oh,
start.
yeah, I know exactly what you mean.
Right. So today we're diving into the fascinating world of nudges, these subtle little things that can influence our decisions, especially when we're feeling unsure. And get this, we're basing this deep dive on some cutting-edge research from a 2020 study led by Venema. They were looking specifically at how social proof can act as a nudge. But before we get too far ahead of ourselves, could you give us a quick rundown of what social proof actually is?
Sure, it's the idea that we tend to look to others for cues on how to behave, especially in situations where we're not really sure what to do. Think about it. If you're trying to pick a restaurant and you see one with a huge line out the door, you're probably more likely to think, hey, that place must be good.
Yeah. Totally. It's like, well, all those people can't be wrong, right?
Sure.
So if social proof is all about following the crowd, how does that connect to these nudges we're talking about?
Well, a nudge is any subtle change in the way choices are presented to kind of encourage a specific behavior, but without taking away other options.
Okay, so it's not about forcing people to do something. It's more like a gentle push in a certain direction.
Exactly. And social proof can be a really effective way to nudge people.
Mm.
Those signs in hotel rooms that say most guests reuse their towels?
Well, yeah.
That's a social proof nudge encouraging you to do the same.
Okay, so nudges are all about subtle influence. But do they actually work? Like, do people actually change their behavior because of these little nudges?
There's actually a lot of research on this. And what researchers have found is that nudges do have an effect, but it's often pretty small.
Hmm, interesting. So maybe they're not as powerful as we sometimes think. Or
Well,
maybe it's they don't work on everyone in the same way.
that's a great question. And that's actually exactly what Venema and their team wanted to find out. They were really interested in whether nudges are more effective when we're already facing some uncertainty.
Okay, that makes sense. Like, if I'm already on the fence about something, maybe a little nudge is all it takes to tip me over to one side. But how do you even measure uncertainty in a scientific way? It's not like you can just ask people, hey, how uncertain are you feeling right now?
Well, they actually use some really creative methods. They designed two separate experiments to test this idea, one focusing on indifference and the other on conflicting preferences.
Okay, hold on. You're throwing some new terms at me here. What's the difference between indifference and conflicting preferences?
So think of indifference as when you just don't really care that much either way, like choosing between two nearly identical shades of blue.
Oh, yeah, I get that. It's like blue, green, whatever. Just give me a color.
Exactly. Low personal relevance. Now, contrast that with conflicting preferences. This is where you do care a lot, but you're torn between different options. Like, let's say you know that eating meat isn't the best for the environment, but you also really love a good burger.
Yeah, that's a tough one.
It is, because there's a conflict between your values and your desires. High relevance, but a tough choice.
Okay, so they tested nudges on people in both of these situations.
Exactly. They wanted to see if the type of uncertainty we're feeling changes how we respond to a nudge. So shall we start with experiment one, the color challenge?
Okay, let's do it. I'm curious to see how they use colors to study this.
Yeah, it's actually pretty clever. So imagine you're in the study and you're asked to look at a screen and categorize colors as either blue or green. Sounds easy enough, right?
Yeah, I think I could handle that.
But here's the catch. They start showing you colors that are right on the edge of blue and green, almost impossible to tell for sure.
Oh, okay, now that would make me sweat a little. I can already feel the uncertainty creeping in. So where does the nudge come in?
Well, some of the participants saw a little bar graph before each color, suggesting that previous people mostly chose green, or sometimes blue, for those really tricky shades.
Oh, sneaky. So it's like the study was saying, hey, most people went with green, maybe you should too. Did people actually fall for it?
Well, the results were pretty interesting. People were indeed more likely to choose green when the nudge suggested it.
Wow, I wouldn't have guessed that. So even for something as seemingly objective as color perception, social proof can still have an effect. Does that mean the nudge actually made people less uncertain about their choice? Like they felt more confident because they had the wisdom of the crowd on their side?
That's what you might think, but the results showed something a little different. The nudge didn't actually reduce their uncertainty, at least not when measured directly.
Wait, so they followed the crowd but still felt just as unsure? How did they even measure uncertainty if they weren't asking people directly?
They used a really cool method called mouse tracking. Basically, they tracked how people's mouse moved on the screen. Because, hesitation and uncertainty often show up in those subtle movements.
Oh, that's fascinating.
And get this, the people who did notice the nudge and found it helpful were actually the ones who were more uncertain to begin with.
So it was like they were grasping for any kind of guidance, even if it didn't totally erase their doubts.
Yeah, exactly. It seems that when we're truly indifferent, meaning we don't really care strongly one way or the other, the nudge might not make us feel less uncertain, but it can still nudge us in a particular direction.
Okay, so we've seen how these social proof nudges can play out even in those low-stakes situations like color perception, where we're basically indifferent to the outcome. But what happens when the choices get more personal, more high stakes?
That's a great question, and that's where experiment two comes in, focusing on those tricky conflicting preferences we talked about earlier. And this one might hit a little closer to home for a lot of us because it's all about the meat paradox.
Okay, now this is where I think a lot of people can relate. The whole meat thing, it's just loaded with ethical concerns, environmental impacts, and of course, those delicious temptations. I'm all ears. How did they set this experiment up?
So they had participants who identified as non-vegetarian take part in a virtual grocery shopping task. And they had to choose whether to select or reject various grocery items, including, you guessed it, meat. And some of those participants got a little nudge along the way.
I bet I can guess what that nudge was all about. Those previous participants, right?
You got it. This time, the nudge was a message letting them know that most people before them had chosen to reject the meat items.
Interesting. So they were basically being told that skipping the steak was the cool thing to do. Did that
Mhm.
actually influence their choices at all?
It's pretty fascinating, actually. On average, the nudge had no effect on overall meat choices.
Hmm. So maybe social proof isn't as powerful when it comes to stuff we have strong opinions about.
Well, remember how we were talking about those different types of uncertainty? Turns out that's really important here. When they dug deeper into the data, they found something really interesting. The people who felt the most conflicted about meat, you know, those torn between loving a good burger and worrying about the impact, those folks were significantly less likely to choose meat when that nudge was present.
Wow. So it's like the nudge gave them that little extra push to align with their values, even if it was a tough choice. That's pretty encouraging, actually.
Oh.
But what about the people who weren't really conflicted about meat, like the ones who were either totally fine with eating it or had already decided to avoid it? Did the nudge have any impact on them?
This is where it gets even more interesting. The nudge actually reduced uncertainty for everyone in the experiment, regardless of how conflicted they felt about meat.
Hold on. So even if people still chose to select the meat, seeing that others had rejected it made them more certain about their own choice.
That's right.
That seems kind of counterintuitive, doesn't it? You'd think seeing other people make different choices would make you second guess yourself.
It's almost like the nudge gave them a point of reference, a social anchor to kind of calibrate their own decision and feel more confident about it.
So even if it didn't change their actual behavior, it changed how they felt about that behavior.
Yeah, exactly. It seems like these nudges can have what researchers call a facilitation effect, making us feel more comfortable with our choices, even if we don't end up following the crowd.
Okay, yeah, I think I get that. Think about a time you were trying to decide whether to order something new at a restaurant, and then you saw someone at another table order the same dish. Even if you didn't end up ordering it, did it make you feel a bit more sure about your own choice?
Yeah, exactly. It's a perfect example. And this whole facilitation effect is something that researchers are still trying to fully understand. It raises a lot of questions about how these nudges work on a deeper level.
It makes you wonder, are there other situations where this facilitation effect might come into play? Like, could it influence bigger decisions like career choices or even relationships?
It's definitely possible, but we need more research to know for sure.
Okay, so we've seen that social proof nudges can be pretty powerful. They can steer our choices when we're unsure, and they can even affect how we feel about those choices. But before we get too carried away with the whole power of the nudge idea, what are the ethics of all this? Is it really okay to be influencing people's behavior, even their feelings, without them necessarily being aware of it?
That's a big question, and it's one that sparked a lot of debate.
I can see both sides of it. On one hand, you could argue that nudges can be used for good, like encouraging people to donate their organs or eat healthier foods or save for retirement.
Right. That's the whole idea behind what's called libertarian paternalism,
Mhm.
using nudges to kind of gently steer people towards choices that are good for them while still respecting their freedom to choose differently.
But on the other hand, there's always the potential for manipulation. Like, what if nudges are being used to push people towards choices that benefit a company or a political party, rather than what's truly best for the individual?
That's a valid concern for sure. And that's why transparency is so important. People have a right to know when and how they're being nudged so they can make informed decisions. It's all about respecting people's autonomy and giving them the power to choose consciously.
So it's not about trying to get rid of nudges altogether, because let's face it, they're everywhere, whether we like it or not.
Mhm.
It's more about becoming aware of them and understanding how they work. So we're not just mindlessly going along with the crowd.
Absolutely. And one of the key takeaways from this research is that we need to be especially careful when we're feeling uncertain, because that's when we're most vulnerable to these nudges.
So it's like having the superpower, the ability to see through those subtle manipulations and make conscious choices that align with our values and goals. But how do we actually do that? Are there any practical tips for becoming more aware of these nudges in our everyday lives?
One of the best things you can do is practice critical thinking.
So it's not just about spotting the nudges, it's about really thinking about whether they should be influencing us.
Exactly. Another helpful tip is to pay attention to your emotions.
Emotions. What do you mean by that?
Well, remember how we talked about that facilitation effect? Nudges can kind of make us feel more certain about our choices, even if we're not consciously aware of them.
Oh, right. Like when you're unsure about a dish at a restaurant, but then someone else orders it, and suddenly you're like, oh, yeah, I'm definitely sticking with my choice.
Exactly. So if you find yourself feeling a sudden burst of certainty, especially when you were feeling kind of iffy before, that can be a little red flag that a nudge might be at work.
That's such a good point. It's like we get a little hit of relief when we see that we're not the only ones who aren't sure. But instead of just going with the flow, we can use that moment to stop and ask ourselves, is this really what I want? Or am I just being swayed by what everyone else is doing?
Exactly. And that brings us to another important tip. Try to get your information from lots of different sources.
Okay, that makes sense. If we only ever hear one perspective, it's easy to fall into that groupthink trap.
Right. So make an effort to seek out different viewpoints, read articles from different publications, talk to people who have different opinions. The more perspectives you consider, the more likely you are to make a decision that truly reflects your own values.
So it's about being more than just a passive consumer of information. We need to be active critical thinkers when it comes to making decisions.
Exactly. It's about taking ownership of our choices and not just letting ourselves be pushed around by outside forces.
I love that. So to wrap things up, we've learned about these nudges that use social proof to try and influence what we do, especially when we're not sure what to choose. And we've seen that they can even change how we feel about our decisions. But the good news is we're not powerless against them.
Absolutely. By becoming more aware of these nudges and really understanding how they work, we can make more conscious and informed choices. Choices that align with our values and goals.
And who knows, maybe we could even start to nudge ourselves in positive directions, creating a choice architecture that helps us live better lives.
That's a great point. It reminds us that even though social influence is a powerful force, we ultimately have the power to choose how we respond to it.
So that's it for our deep dive into the world of social proof and nudges. I don't know about you, but I'm feeling a lot more equipped to make conscious choices, even when I'm not sure what to do.
It's amazing what a little knowledge and self-awareness can do.
Absolutely. So until next time, everyone stay curious, stay critical, and don't be afraid to question the crowd.